This is Julianne Condia, host of Rewritten. Thank you so much for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
I'm the Greg.
And I am Dave Show.
We host the Greg and Dave Show on Public House Media.
Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media. Once you're done with this episode, I hope you'll come check out our show, The Greg and Dave Show, where we talk about strange, bizarre, and sometimes just downright quirky news stories that you may not have heard about.
A new show comes out every Wednesday. Be sure to subscribe on iTunes. And hey, thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
How to Write Good. I'm your host, Daniel Poppy. Find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. If you haven't already, you can check out my book that is out. It's already too late to get it for free. You should have gotten it last week when I told you. But there will probably be other times when it is, so pay attention when it is because it won't always be. This podcast is brought to you by Public House Media. I thought I had something else to say, but I guess I don't. I thought there was something else I was going to tell everyone, but I guess there isn't for whatever reason. I don't know, I just forgot. Our word of the week is create. So create means to bring into being. It also means to make or beget or cause. Makes sense, right? Everybody knows that word. We're actually going to jump into the etymology of that. Create comes from the Latin creare, and you can argue with me on how you say that, but the Catholic Church is the only group that actually speaks Latin anymore, and they probably would be saying it the same way. So I'm going to go with how they say it. So from creare is a verb form which means to create, but it actually comes from a Proto-Indo-European word which means to grow, and I think that's kind of interesting. So there you go. If you haven't guessed, we're going to be talking about art. I guess we're going to be talking about art this week. So we're going to actually jump right into our accidental lessons, and I'm going to actually explain where my idea came from. That I'm about to cough, so I'll have to cut that out if I do, unless you prefer hearing me cough, but I don't think you will. But I actually decided to do this podcast and this specific topic because so Evan Swanky, who is on, so I'm going to give him a shout out, who is on. Now it's been 2 weeks ago, so he was on the last. Sorry, I'm trying to turn on a light. He was on the last week of August. Okay, and we actually talked about creativity and just like the desire to create something. But he actually has a podcast. He started one immediately after that. Pretty much, he started one like the next day, and I was just listening to it. And his first if you want to go check it out, it's called Pod Wars. I'm going to give him a shout out. So check it out. It's Pod Wars. I was on his third episode. It's his third episode, but it's not numbered because he's doing Star Wars and he's just doing other pop culture and creative things. So you can check that out if you want to. But his first episode is about Rick and Morty. His second episode. I'm sorry. His second episode is about Rick and Morty. And as I was listening to it, he had two other people on, so I'm not going to credit him with his thought because it wasn't his thought. But he actually had two other people on, and one of the people, maybe he was saying this as well. Well, he was saying this as well. One of the people was saying how they're talking about. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background to this show. So this is a really, really popular show. It kind of exploded. I actually found out about it just before it exploded. I found out about it. I lived with some guys who loved it, who thought it was great, and it is a really, really funny show. I'll give it that. I think it's a really intelligent and really funny show. I think the fan base is insane. Not Evan and his friends. I don't think they're insane, but I think there's a large contingent, not all of them, of the fan base who are too immature, I guess, and they take things from the show and they try to mimic it in real life, which you can't do because the show is off the wall crazy. So the show is very nihilistic. I know they used, if you want to go check out the episode, I can't remember what the episode is called for his podcast is Pod Wars, but the nihilistic tendency of the show, and you notice this when you're watching, it's very, very evident. When you're watching it, there's always this idea that people aren't important and there's no larger picture, there's no there's no importance to humans. Humans don't matter. We are just going through life, and when we die, it doesn't matter at all. So that's a really simplified version. The show actually presents it a little better, but it's essentially like that. I think at some point in the show, there were those words or something very, very close to those words were said by one of the characters. So since they were talking about that show, they were talking about how this show is essentially a search for meaning. And the creators actually have this thought, what is it called? So it's called cosmicism, where humans don't mean anything at all, and the world and nothing else means anything. So they kind of, I'm going to actually give you a little bit more background right now. So there's humanism, there's like secular humanism, which secular humanism is there is no God, there is no nothing beyond humans, and humans are extremely important. And then this cosmicism, I think it's cosmism or something like that, is that humans, there's no God, and and humans are totally unimportant. So what they were talking about in the podcast, I'm just going to give them credit for this, is that these creators, there's two creators, I can't remember their name, of the show, and they believe that these creators were using the show as kind of like they're playing around and trying to find meaning in a meaningless universe. And I think this is a really, really interesting thought. And as I was thinking about this, they had a comment. I'm going to say they had a comment, not me. And I'm just jumping off of this comment, that it's really interesting that there's these people who they're kind of lost in a way. They don't know what's going on. And if you believe that there isn't any meaning to the universe, you are lost because you don't know what's going on with it. And I guess that if there is meaning and you know what that meaning is, you're not lost. So, and I guess that's another discussion for another time. But what they said is like, oh, you have these people who are artistic or creative, and they are like in this depth. They're in like this hole of thinking. And I don't want to say these guys are unintelligent. I don't want to say these guys can't think well, because if you watch the show, it's a very intelligent show in terms of how it's put together. So I don't want to say that, but think of it as a whole of thinking. So in my mind, there's a very logical train of thought. If you say, okay, well, humans are all that exists, and that's it. The logical train of thought is humans are all that exists, or not humans are all that exists, but there is no God. If no God exists, you can't argue for morality. You have to go back to a being that supports that morality that you're using as a sounding board to say, okay, why are we created? And then the being either sets it in place that there's a morality built into the system, or there is, or the being tells people. Okay, so or it could be both, right? But if there is nothing, I think if you're going to be honest, you have to say that there's no morality. We do not matter, because all that's going to happen, if you really think about life and human life, let's just say, okay, so you've got a handful of people. You can probably name, I don't know how many people in history that you can name, but let's just think back 3,000 years. In 3,000 years, things get iffy, because around that time we had like Alexander the Great, but things started to be written about him like 60 years after I think he died. I think longer. I think it was like 150. But don't quote me on that. So it gets iffy with what his life is. But we say, oh, he's really, really important because he did this. Other people that are really important in history is there's Genghis Khan. There's the Roman emperors. Now we're getting a little bit farther into the present. Now there's the founding fathers of the United States. Anyone who's been a president of the United States. But even let's just fast forward like 2,000 years into the future. How many of those people that we see as so important, even 50 years ago or 100 years ago, how many people are actually going to be important? How many people are actually going to be remembered, or are people going to care about? And if you think logically, and I think if you are honest with yourself and you say, okay, there is no God, what's going to happen to most people who exist in the world, to most human beings, and there's a very small minority that this doesn't happen to. Most people are going to die, and within about 25, 30, 50 years tops, people are going to forget about them. And even if people remember them, it's not going to matter much. It's going to be remembering somebody you barely even knew or somebody you didn't know at all, right? There's 2 generations or maybe 3 where people will remember you after you die, and after that you're gone. Nobody remembers you. Nobody remembers you as a real human being, and all that matters is the people who are alive at that time. Now you could argue, well, what if I make art, right? What if I make art and I influence people in the future, right? And I live on beyond my time on Earth. Well, you're not living on beyond your time on Earth, first of all, because you're not living. You've made something and it's affecting people. But at the same time, how long is your art actually going to last? Let's just say your art is phenomenal. Let's just say you're Shakespeare level. Let's just say you're Shakespeare level unbelievable. And your art, it's been 500 years. How long are we going to look at Shakespeare and say, oh, that's great. Okay, let's go back. Beowulf made it, right? One of the reasons why Beowulf is lauded is because it's so stinking old. It's one of the only things from that time period. I know there are other things from that time period, but there's only a handful of things that we have, the handful of things that are complete. So that's so important because it's from that time period. But in this present age, if you fast forward 1,000 years, there's 1 billion books, right? Now people might be able to sift and sort through your books, but your books are even less important because they're in a vast library of books. And eventually, let's fast forward 1 million years into the future. Let's just say people are still alive on Earth. People still exist, and let's just say we are looking back into the past. 1 million years into the future, I don't know how long people are going to be around. How many people are actually going to matter from our lifetime, right? Maybe one. So after you die, there's nothing. There's no point. I don't think there's really a point to doing stuff on Earth. I really don't I don't see there being a point to building yourself up or becoming great, because if you really look at it in the grand scheme of things, if there is no God, if there's nothing beyond this life, it's going to be gone. Now, I think that I had one other thought related to that. Now, you could say that, okay, well, I'm going to make this life as good as I possibly can. And I think that you have to go... So the guy who created, or the guy who the Marquis de Sade, he kind of goes along this line. He essentially goes the way of hedonism. He says that if there's nothing beyond this earth, if we're going to be honest, we have to just multiply the pleasure we have in our life, because that's all we have, and our life should be as fulfilled as possible, and fulfilled in his mind was pleasurable. And I guess you can argue against that. You could say, oh, well, life isn't fulfilled if it's pleasurable, and I would say that's true, but you are trying to make your life the best it can be. And if you argue from that perspective, people are like, well, we should make everybody's life as good as it can possibly be. And you could argue, I think, pretty well that if everyone's going to die, it doesn't really matter in the end, right? Because if we don't matter, it doesn't really matter if people's lives are good or bad. So if you have that mindset, I don't have that mindset. If you have that mindset, I think and if you think that the world is meaningless, if you think that life is meaningless, I think there is a desire to find meaning in life. I think that everybody would agree that even if life is truly meaningless, in the end, people are trying to find meaning in life. Is that fair? I think that's fair. Even if you think life is meaningless, you still want to at least feel as if your life has meaning. So people are searching for meaning, and I think that this plays out in the real world. Now, what they said, what Evan said, and his guest said in his podcast, Pod Wars, second episode, is that it's really interesting that you have these people who are searching for meaning, who don't have something to grasp onto, who are really, they don't know what to do, and they don't know how to live, they don't know how to understand things, and they keep on searching and searching and searching. Okay, and because of that, and these people who keep on searching and searching and searching make these beautiful works of art. They make these things that are just off the wall, different than everybody else is thinking. That's what I want to talk about. I think that there's tons of people who are artistic, Sorry, my computer's doing something funny. There's tons of people who are artistic, and they're lost. Let's just call it like that. I'm not trying to look at it from a religious perspective, but there's a lot of people who are very creative, who are in different, who are very prominent, who are extremely artistic in whatever field they choose to be in. And you look at their lives, and I know this isn't everyone, so I'm not trying to say this is everyone, but a lot of people, there's just so much stuff in their lives that is in disarray. I think this is especially the case for a lot of young people, and because you see all these really young actors and actresses, because they're the most prominent. It might just be because they're really extremely famous, but they're the most prominent, and they just go wild. But if you look back in the past, there's been all these people who create all this beautiful art, and they just had really awful lives. Or even someone who produces these really interesting thoughts and has a terrible life. Now, you could say, well, not everybody who produces art has this awful life. I think that there's two reasons people produce art, really, really good art. I'm not just talking about art in general. So if you read my book, you'll be like, okay, you're not in this class, whatever. But I think for when people produce art, they fall into either this camp where they're just searching for something, so they keep on trying things out, right? And then there's this camp that is more religiously based. I'm going to talk about the first one first. Now, I think this is really interesting, and I think that if you go back to my interview, the podcast, it's not really an interview because we're just talking. If you go back to the podcast with Dan Fear, so I think it's called Creativity and Dan, because I used to put guests at the beginning of the episode title, and now they're at the end. If you go back to that episode, we talk about stuff, and I brought up this idea like, do you think that struggle and pain and difficulty create a situation where somebody becomes creative? Is that the reason why somebody becomes creative? And the reason why I was thinking that is, well, if there's struggle and pain, people try to find a way to get away from that, so they dissociate, and because they dissociate, they learn to do that as a habit, and they get away. So I think that in a lot of cases, for people who are extremely prominent in their creative field, I don't know if this is the same in other fields as well. Maybe it is. Maybe it's because of everyone. So I think that people have a desire in themselves. I think that there's a desire for meaning. And I think there's this quote, whatever you think about him, there's this quote by Jim Carrey. I think it's by him because it's always attributed to him when I see it. It says, people always think, it's along the lines, I'm paraphrasing. So it's people always think that being rich and famous is the answer when it really isn't. That's not the exact quote, but that's essentially the quote. And I think that people actually do. I think that people envy people who are super rich. And I know that it's easy to do that. You look and you're like, man, you grew up in a really rich family. For me, like, I didn't at all. And it's just like, wow, like these people grew up in a really rich family where money wasn't like, it's just an unbelievable wealth, right? And I think that somebody who is creative, someone who, let's just say a musician, let's go off with a musician. For a musician, there's a lot of musicians who are like, yeah, this is what's going to happen. Like, I don't feel so good right now. Like, I'm kind of in the dumps. And how it works is they work their butt off. They work their butt off to get really good, and they work their butt off to spread their music around. They work their butt off to get an audience, because when you're a creative person, I think you really do have to do that. I think it's a very hard field, or any of these fields are really hard to get started and really hard to get going in. I just think you have to put in the work. And then they go and they get on this rush. Suddenly stuff starts getting together. There's a snowball effect, and they're like, man, everything's going. And they get to the top and they're like, nothing's here, right? But I think that struggle, where they keep on going after something, is a search for meaning, or trying to put meaning together. They're trying to figure out what their life is about. I think this would also explain why there's more people who are, I don't think they're necessarily secular, but I think it would explain why more people, I guess they are. It would explain why more people who are really big in the arts are more secular, or maybe they're nominally religious. Most people aren't, let's just say that. Or most people who are religious, or a lot of people, I shouldn't say most, a lot of people who are religious in the arts were not religious until after they got into it. So they got big, and then they became religious because they realized there was more to life than that. But I think there's a thought in humans that they can kind of make their own meaning, and I don't really agree with that. I've never really found that to be true in my own life. I know the struggle of thinking that you're going to be really big in some creative field. Like, I've known the struggle of being like, well, if only I can do this, or if only I can do that. But I think that that's human nature, right? I think people are in a interesting predicament, if we want to call it that, where they don't feel complete, if that makes sense. They don't feel complete. And so they try to do something to change their lives to become complete. And I'm not trying to get religious about this at all. I'm not going to get religious about this at all. I think that if you want, I've already said I'm a Christian, so you can probably just do some research and figure out where I stand on this. And because this is my experience, right? So this idea that like you go and you're seeing something and you don't feel complete, that's my experience, and that's why I think it's the case where I think that pretty much everybody in the world, most of the time, I think there's a few people who don't feel this way. I think the majority of people do. Most of the time, people are like, man, I'm in this situation. Life is just, I don't know, dull, fragmentary, if you want to call that. Is that the word? Fragmentary? Fragmentary, I think is how you say it. And I don't feel complete. And I think that people who aren't creative try to figure out how to work that out in their own lives. But I think people who are creative, and if they're they go either two ways. They kind of give up, right? They give up and they're like, well, I guess I'm not good enough to do this creative thing. Or they keep at it and they keep on going, and they think that making it as an artist or whatever form of art they're in is going to be what gives them meaning. So that's one type of really creative person. And the reason why I think they're so good is because they give their lives to that, right? They give up so much of their lives to do this, and they think, oh, like music or writing or art itself is going to be the thing that completes me. I feel so good when I do it. I feel like I'm in a flow and all the time is passing and nothing can go wrong. But I think when you sit back and you take a few minutes and you're actually in that situation, you suddenly realize you're like, no, this isn't actually what's making my life. And I think that I'm not someone in a position to answer that question. I'm not someone who's extremely famous. I'm not someone who's a celebrity. I'm not someone who is like the best writer in the world at all. But I think that if you ask somebody this question who is, they'd be like, yeah, this is fun and I love doing it, but at the same time, it's not what makes me as a person, right? I think there's more to life than that. So I had something else I was going to say, and it completely went out of my mind. So that's one side of it. I think there's these people who get so good at the craft because they work so hard at it because they think it's going to complete them. And I think the other side is there's people who are, they already believe something, and they work so hard at the thing because they believe something, and then they produce something beautiful because of it. And some people might be like, well, I don't think that's true because most of the people who are creative are not religious, or they aren't really religious at all. And I would say to that, I would be like, well, it might be the case that anyone who pushes themselves that far, either they are just not religious, or maybe they are. Maybe we just don't know. Maybe they are just not religious, and then they become religious, or they just I don't know what I was going to say, or they push themselves hard because of their religion. And I'm not pointing out any one religion. I just think that I think that there's two ways of going about things if you're religious, or if you think there's something beyond humans. I think the first way of going about it is saying, well, I mean, I don't need to do anything. I'm all right. This is okay. Life is good. Therefore, I'm not going to do anything. Or there's people who get to work and be like, wow, this is awesome. This is great. I'm going to do something that reflects this greatness, whatever that greatness is. Because if there is something beyond humans, that thing is greater than humanity, right? I think that we could say that without getting into stuff. But yeah, so going back to this show, Rick and Morty, I think it's really interesting that they are just searching for meaning, and they what they do, and I think that in the podcast, they were citing what the creators were saying, and the creators were essentially attempting to find meaning in a meaningless world. And I just want to say a quick thing about that. I actually think so. I'm sure there's people who are Christians who are listening to this. I know people who listen to this, so they're Christians. But even people who aren't, I think this is an interesting thought. I think how the world presents itself to people is, and how people experience it, in a lot of ways, it is meaningless, right? I don't personally think that life is meaningless, but I think that how life is presented to humans, how people experience life, that it is meaningless. Not that it's experienced as meaningless, not that it actually is meaningless, because I don't think it's meaningless. Let me say that again. I don't think it's meaningless. This is why I think it's experienced in that way. If you think about it, we have a very limited view of anything. We live a life, and we have this box. We have a box of life, and we know stuff that's happened in the past. We know what people are capable of. We're like, wow, like technology is really cool because we can do so much with technology, but we still are boxed in because we know we're going to die someday. If you're really honest with yourself, you know you're going to die. And one thing that's, I'm past, but a couple of years ago, I was thinking about that constantly. I'm like, man, I'm going to die. Like, this is really crazy. Like, there's going to be one day where I'm really old and I'm going to be gone. And, if you actually are honest with yourself, you're like, okay, we are going to die. And there's uncertainty about what's going to happen after. I think there are certain people I know who are like, yeah, I'm 100% certain about everything I believe. And to be honest with people, I think about stuff and I'm like, well, I'm not 100% certain. I think that from a Christian perspective, I'm like, well, I gotta let God take care of that for me, of my uncertainty, but I'm not always 100% certain. Sometimes I'm like, I don't know. And if you really, the only, and I don't even think this is correct, the only philosophical stance that gets you kind of close or allows you to think, the only philosophical stance, let me get back to that. The philosophical stance that probably is the closest to what allows us to think about stuff as real, like of knowing anything, is probably the more scientific one. So in science, you only base your observations and what you say on what you can see and feel and measure, right? So there's, I think that philosophical stance is probably the closest we're going to get to like complete certainty about stuff, if that makes sense. And the next one is, well, maybe this one comes before the scientific, but then there's logic and trying to get down to basic axioms about stuff. So with those two philosophical stances, or with those two platforms you're looking out at the world from, you don't really get a lot of information, honestly. You get, okay, there's an outside world. There's specific things that are automatically true or automatically false, like I am either alive or I am not alive. I am not alive and dead as I am understanding it at this time. But beyond that, unless there is a supernatural being and coming in and doing something, you get to the end of your life and you die and you realize you're like, that's it, right? And then it's done. So I think that there is a certain amount of chaos in the system that we're in, and I think that you can argue why that's the case. And I think that even if you do believe in a God, or I don't know, whatever you believe in, if you believe in a oneness of something, whatever it is, I think you can still believe, or you still experience this, gap within yourself. Does that make sense? You still experience that chaos. You still experience that meaninglessness, because chaos is meaninglessness. And I don't know. I just think that, I really find it, I don't know. I think that in some cases, people who are extremely atheistic and extremely arrogant about it are annoying. I think that's the same with anyone. I think that if you're I don't like you if you're pompous, but I think that if you're atheistic and you're arrogant and you're like, well, these people are just stupid because they think that, I think it's stupid. And I think that if you have that stance and you think that about anyone, it's stupid. But if you're honest about it and you're like, hey, like, I don't know what to think about this, and I'm just going to explore these ideas, I really appreciate that, actually. And from anyone, if someone is a Christian, if someone ascribes to a specific Christian doctrine and they're like, well, like, life is really uncertain. There's a lot of uncertain things. I'm going to explore this idea, and I don't know this completely, and I can't rely on myself or my own thinking. I think that's a really good thing, because honestly, you can't rely on yourself and your thinking about everything. So I guess this episode was a bit different. I just had the thought based on Evan Swanke's podcast episode. Check it out if you want to. It doesn't get this far into philosophical things, but it does talk about some philosophical things in it, which is interesting. I don't know. It's just there's some interesting ideas. If you want to watch the show, you can. It's certainly a preference, really. There's some people who, if I showed it to them, they'd be like, "This is the worst show in the world," and there's other people who would laugh their heads off. So whatever. If you don't like the show, or if you do. But yeah, I think that we do have to wrestle with that uncertainty, and there's certainly things I believe that answer that uncertainty. But I think that until you shouldn't feel forced into believing something, right? You shouldn't feel forced into believing it. It's because it's not really believing it if you're coerced into believing it. So yeah, just if you don't know what to think about something, just take your time, think about it, try to figure it out, explore those different ideas. All right, and that brings us to our logical fallacy of the week. Our logical fallacy of the week is appeal to accomplishment, okay? And this is a type of appeal to authority to a certain degree. So appeal to accomplishment is you're saying that something is true or false based on the accomplishments of the proposer, but that's not how logic works. Because if there is someone who hasn't accomplished anything and they're making a logical argument, just because someone says they are wrong does not make that argument wrong. So even if that person is the president of the United States, or even if that person has 16 PhDs, just because they say it's wrong does not make the other person wrong. This happens a lot, I think, with people. You see this with people who have accomplished a lot. They're like, well, you've never done this. Like, well, you haven't. You see people say stuff like, well, what have you done with your life, essentially? And just because you are saying that's kind of a logical fallacy. So really, you can say it to make yourself feel better, but in the end, you've just got to take what they say and see if it's actually true. So that's all I've got for you this week. As always, this is How to Write Good, and I'm Daniel Poppy. Said it wrong this time? Bye.